We sort of plan out how we're going to be implementing this particular new provisions to the regs, especially on what specific information you will be requiring from the businesses who will be registered under this kind of business. What kind of information you will be inquiring from them, and how would you plan to require any kind of reports when they report, how often they report. The thing is, we don't want to give too much of a burden for, especially small business that's still starting, to be overburdened by the the amount of regulation information that they need to provide. That's the kind of complaint that we always get from this business community when we impose so much requirements as far as regulations. Tend to complain about the burden and the cost just to comply with these rules.
Thank you so much. So yes, we've definitely put some thought into this because we don't want to provide undue burden, but we also want to be able to understand all the sectors quite well. So there is the registration requirements, and I know that it's not as expansive or as detailed as it could be. So of course we'll have the standard information that's being provided to tax, and also locationally where these reporting entities located. The other thing that we're looking at asking for is basically whether or not they're going to self-assess whether or not they meet the requirements of the Money Laundering Act. And we're going to put together guidance so that people understand what they're supposed to do and have a template in place so that they're able to create their own policies and procedures. So the things that they are mainly obligated to do would be to have policies and procedures in place, to have a compliance officer, somebody, the point of contact, to do trainings annually, to report suspicious transactions and CTRs. And then there's a couple of other small things, maintain books, do KYC, things like that. But in the initial registration, we're not going to ask for all of those things. They just need to tell us whether or not they have them. So that's to start, because we understand it's difficult. We've talked with the attorneys when we onboarded the attorneys, and even the attorneys were like, what do we do? And so we understand it's a difficult process to do, but that's to help us gauge where everybody is on that and to also gauge like who's part of it. Now, we're only requiring annual re-registration. So over the course of a year, or if they have a change in basic information. So over the course of the year, if their information changes, or when it comes to the next year, they re-register. The ideal situation is they grow, right? And so they have a bigger customer base, things like that. But the other thing that we're looking at is size of the entity and what their customer base is, how much money they move. And that will help us risk, right? Because if they're really small, and they don't do a lot of financial, like through the financial institutions, or go send their money overseas, then they're lower risk and we don't have to focus as much on them. And they might not have as much to give us. But if they're really big, or we recognize that they're very high risk, then they might have to provide us with more information. We might reach out and be like, show us your policies and procedures, things like that. But the basic initial information shouldn't be too arduous. It's just a fill out to start with, and then we'll adjust as we go. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, you partly answered. Thank you for that. I guess to be more specific, suppose somebody wants to apply for a license to start some kind of a payment system using like a stablecoin, for example. How would he apply? He would go to the tax office and get a business license first, or they go to you. What sort of guidance require for people who wants to do something like that?
So I believe we put in here that it's 90 days. So they will, 30 days. So they would go and get their business license first, and then 30 days after they'd register with us.
Okay, and so when they register with you, you mentioned some of the information. Those are the information that we require for them. As far as reporting, what specific information do you require for them to report?
I'm going to defer to Boboy since he deals with our reporting a bit more than I do.
So reporting, as far as the reporting institutions with the registry, the ngara asum ngaringam lama mangot ser omgot lomo se di seng mlachen sa scope ra okya kami komdimle alaurar adra senet hindi la kumla openangi mar atra house mo agigira mom tangi, because that's part of how we assess the risk. Agi mom tangi sa so mga nga changes ra kami agigira dal reassess ra risk ra kami sa komorbab or komlorio. So that's part of the reporting process. As far as Selco reporting side from the AML side, I get activities over 10,000. Over 10,000. I file a reporting institution in what's called the currency transaction report. I get anything that's over $10,000. I'll say cash. What check payments are not counted towards that. Either single payment or aggregate in a very short amount of time that the institution has reason to believe that they are linked. Say that one report. And then a longer report that they're required to is what's called a suspicious transaction report. A threshold ringing. You can just go and say adal mora shobay ask mo lugumak miskawa 11,000, what would happen? And then a shobay mo agi mo rula mo prepare a CTR file ring FIU. And then adak mo okay ere maududele todo el maral. Sel kumbali by law and the regulations agirel reporter say even though ndim lakaw though they'll change hand. Because that is a suspicious activity. So hindi ka threshold ring. It was just an activity that was deemed suspicious by either a bank or a designated non-financial business or profession.
What kind of risk are you looking at? Are you looking at the risk, and how do you assess the risk? The type of business.
So a big part of it, when assessing risk, the type of product, the range of consumers that are allowed on that particular product. So I brought up like a credit union. Let me use an example. Credit union, Catholic Church. Say it's a credit union created by the Catholic Church for members of the church. And they did a lot, they sold stocks just to those members of the church. And then ang cap on how much they can borrow from the association. And where they actually, and then one of their policies, aviaka castle change hand. Arogul payment that I get, whatever you borrow from the credit union is a direct allotment del morabang. So that's part of how it becomes very low risk. There is actually no change in although the manamal del mora financial institution, so it gets captured. So it makes it very low. There's very little risk of them laundering money because their amount could be allow the loan and more up to 500 tala. And then you would have to, some of them go as far as say, giremel at least ka naharara 80% or tiyal loan araw before agim lutel miskaw. Mang modya kay lila adal abuse or tiyal structure.
Referring specifically for a payment system, something that we have been kind of thought about before, something like a stable coin, like the trial. One of the things we try to do is to try to offer different forms of financial services that will be available for not just Palauans, but also our Casta, our tourists. When they come to Palau, they will have these options of payment, making it more easier for businesses to conduct their business. Area of the payment system that we were considering is that considering our culture where, when during funeral, people want to, gather money and make payment, to the custom or our cultural event. And so we want to allow for some kind of system that where our people in outside of Palau can transfer their money easily with a very limited fees, bank fees that's going to be associated with it. And we were thinking about the concept of stablecoin as a means to allow for that opportunity. So in the event that somebody wants to start a business like that, so they register as a local company to facilitate this kind of money transfer how much of requirement or information regarding that particular business activity do you require from the business?
It would be the same as what we require from a bank. Yeah.
The list of customers and the amount of money that are being transferred.
So
back and
some of
forth?
one of the requirements that all reporting entities have to do is they have to know their customer. And the point of knowing your customer is to be able to determine whether or not they do something out of pattern, right?
Okay.
So let's say you have, for example, somebody that doesn't work and they want to transfer money off island, like they get a stipend or something of $100, and they want to transfer it to, a friend in the United States, for example, and that they want to do this through blockchain or stablecoin. But okay, they don't work. They get a stipend of $100. They transfer it once a month. You know that this happens, right? So you're like, okay, this guy's okay. But then if it spikes, so let's say he comes across like $20,000 and all of a sudden he's transferring $20,000 in total over the course of a month. That's outside the scope of what he can do. So because you know your customer, you know that's suspicious. So those are the types of things that you're trying to keep an eye on and why the policies and procedures are in place, because you're able to tell, is this person high risk? Do I know, does that look out of pattern for them? So there's nothing wrong with that type of business. It's just what safeguards does the company have in place to meet these anti-money laundering standards and to help mitigate the risk?
Does the U.S. Financial system, the central bank, handle that kind of control, or any kind of transaction that utilize a U.S. dollar? Does the U.S. system has access to those kind of information?
It doesn't necessarily. It depends on if it's a U.S. institution. So for the purposes of our banks, the big financial institutions, the U.S. does receive that information, and they're also regulated by regulators in the United States. Every country basically is working towards compliance with these international norms and having the same or a similar regulatory process in place. The U.S. now is moving towards the regulation of virtual asset service providers because now they're letting them move through the market with this new administration. And so, yeah, the U.S. does have access to that information as well. And if it's bank to bank, the U.S., if it goes to a U.S. bank, then the regulators in the United States would see that as well.
And that include the payment system that's utilizing U.S. dollar?
It depends on if the payment system is open or closed and where the onboarding is, right? So if the payment system is just one for here in Palau, it doesn't go off island, and the financial institution that's using it is not one of the 3 FDIC insured banks, we don't have another option right now, but then the U.S. regulator wouldn't see that. If it's open and goes off island, potentially to the United States, then the regulator there would see it.
Okay.
So a good example is Binance. Binance has a Binance US and Binance International.
Enough.
They're 2 very separate entities. One is allowed to operate and regulated in the United States. The other one doesn't comply with it. So that's where the issue comes up is, if you're in the United States, they will regulate you.
Sige, Chairman, ako mitral ko paint scenario al dokara mo malat das ringig mil adra board. Since etial kita dia ka central bank gargin. Abelwada recognize US dollar, that's a designated currency those paying US dollar. I think that's the only currency the designated as a legal tender for PALAU transactions. Sel ngara al mangara kay gidel gora tora protector tial dala ma ay gidel tora financial transactions. Ako doesn't greatly rest with the US financial institutions, especially the US Central Financial Control or Banking System. Di kal makita po the system mo eda gidel wal additional requirement regulation gidel lolo nga sir Amerikel. Hindi al baby at time kada dire kalwa po Amerikel amos pe gidel wal imal al mga tmok lay gidel tora money laundering at our own expense. Sige kita dire kalgiyadan mo klakar ngiling al sugo makata malay kay kita additional responsibility and balgulak nasing maagira tal dire kal mo o additional resources to build ramen power kami your capacity to be able to handle this, and these are not easy task to get you out. To be honest with you, it's a very sophisticated industry where we will require a very not smart but very people who have a very extensive experience and knowledge about the banking and the financial system, especially the U.S. with a very broad financial system. Mang domi sa gigi kuk di adapt tayo guk sa pwede remove within our capacity. Ay guk tiakal sa pwede the create sa gigi ko partnership la banggala Amerigel ay gigi del FATF may gal baby agencies ra blue adal da kay nga sol di sa guk tasal mal di reliable wad man mo overregulated ma-point na mo diya ka amal gorawngil ni uchi ray kay the regulation na kumna sing gira dalwa magi ko gid step by step toward that siya akadim na swakal duli mang kadamang daswerngi may amal masara ang ilureri